All right, let's talk about battlefronts. Letter A, Germany. Germany had a two-part strategy that we are going to attack the Germans with. We're going to try to overcome their submarines, and we're going to try to bomb their German cities. Now, obviously, in order to get to Germany and bomb the cities, we have to be able to get into France, conquer France, and then go back and get the Germans. Now, Germans sank over 500 Allied ships, but eventually, the use of our radar and sonar, we were able to win these sea battles because we were able to see them coming, whereas before we didn't really have that luxury. Bombing runs grew more successful as the war carried on, and the lines between military and civilian targets became very blurred, more so in Japan itself. Um, when you think about what I mean by the blurred lines there, we're literally saying that sometimes the military target itself was worth it, but sometimes you get more attention from the government if you have a civilian target. The Allies focused first on North Africa. Both Eisenhower and Bernard Montgomery from British were successful in driving the Germans back by 1943, and we were able to conquer North Africa. And then from there, the next move would be to work through Sicily, which is the tip of the boot, if you think about that, and move north through Italy. Italy was widely considered the soft, literally, this is the quote that they used, the soft underbelly of Europe, meaning it was very, very easy for us to go and attack them because they were soft. They weren't very good fighters. And so we worked through there, and by the summer of 1943, Mussolini would actually be taken out of power. They would take him, his own citizens would take him, and they would hang him, they would kill him in the city square, and they would get rid of him, knowing that they were pretty much doomed. Now, why would they do this? Very similar to the same way they did this in World War II, World War One. They wanted to get the spoils of war, and they were hoping that the Allies would be less mean and less uh, destructive when it came to the end of the war towards Italy. Now, German would send massive troops to occupy northern Italy. Even as late as 1945, they still had troops in northern Italy. Italy wasn't an, I mean, I said that they were soft underbelly of Europe, but the geography made it difficult for us to conquer them quickly. D-Day. This is the massive invasion of Europe that would take place on June 6th, 1944. British, Canadian, and U.S. forces would secure several beachheads around the Normandy area. Beachhead just means that you hold the area between the ocean and the land. And the Allies were able to move through France and to focus on getting to Germany. And by August of 1944, Paris is freed and they begin to make a push for Berlin. Now, the D-Day invasion is, I wish we could spend more time on it, but it's just an amazing feat. I'll probably link a video, a couple of videos on the D-Day invasion that you guys can watch on your own. But the D-Day invasion was just an amazing amphibious invasion, the largest in history. And the Germans were not expecting us to attack where we did. We did a lot of cool things to distract them and let them know that we weren't going to attack there. We actually used inflatables on the shorelines of England so that they would think that we were going to attack from different areas. It might be like inflatables of what? Well, tanks, airplanes, and transports, those type of things. The Germans did make a desperate push back in the Battle of the Bulge. You guys have probably heard of that. Though fairly successful at the beginning, the Allies regrouped and advanced well into Germany. Now, we were trying to get to Berlin because, again, if you get to the capital, then you can you're the victor. And to the victor go the spoils. However, the Russians were trying to do the same thing, and it was kind of a race to Berlin. Here's the thing. If you get there, you might try to get there quickly, but you're going to be sacrificing a lot of human lives in order to get there itself. The Russians weren't afraid of that. That was kind of their method of fighting. And Allied bombing runs had reduced Germans' industrial capacity for war, meaning they couldn't produce many more tanks and guns and airplanes. Recognizing the end of the war as Russia was getting close to Berlin, Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, 1945. A week later, Germany gave an unconditional surrender to the Allies, and VE Day is as a result, and that is on May 8th, 1945. And so we were able to defeat the Germans. Many people did not think that they were going to be able to do that, but think of it like this. Germany had pretty much dominated part of Europe, so going back to the 1930s, late 1936-ish, and then you get to 1941, and by 42, America's involved. They had reigned for a while, 6 years, and then in about a year and a half, 2 years, Americans were able to conquer them. As U.S. troops advanced through Germany, they came across many concentration camps where the mass extermination of Jews was taking place. Over 6 million Jews and over a million non Jews were part of this mass genocide, which is the wiping out of an entire human race by the Germans. Many were critical of the U.S. not stopping this carnage earlier and not allowing Jews into the U.S. during a time of war. FDR would simply reply to this by stating that the goal was to win the war, and freeing all the camps would have been extremely difficult because of how far behind enemy lines they were. Many Jews who were rescued from these spots had said they would have almost rather the Americans bomb these sites than allow them to go through the torturous life that they went through. And it was really, truly amazing. And again, I'll send another link to a documentary, well, I guess it's kind of like a mini series called Band of Brothers, where they come upon one of these camps. I think visually it does a very good job of showing you what was really happening in these prison camps. But a horrific situation, and kind of showed our troops why we were there, why we were fighting. And when you get to Japan, mostly American troops were the ones responsible for fighting in Japan, and that would make sense because they were the ones who attacked us. Now, eventually, British are going to send some people down there, mainly because they're trying to protect Australia, but for the most part, Americans were the ones that were fighting. Japan had seized control of much of Asia and the southeast, meaning like Indonesia, Malaysia, those areas. The Battle of Midway signified the change of the war in the Pacific. Over June 4th through the 7th of 1942, the USA was able to destroy 4 Japanese carriers and over 300 planes. This would basically be the end and the furthest extent of the Japanese expansion. Obviously, it's called Battle of Midway because it was at Midway Island, which is midway between America and Asia in the Pacific Ocean. I have not seen the movie, so I've not seen the movie. I need to watch that. I've heard it's pretty good, so I can't attest to the historical accuracy of the movie because I haven't seen it. Island hopping was the idea to get closer and closer to mainland Japan. Early in the war in the Pacific, MacArthur and U.S. troops were thwarted in the Philippines. By 1944, MacArthur had fulfilled his promise to return. And at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which was the largest naval battle in history, the Japanese Navy was virtually destroyed. This was, however, the first time that they would intentionally use kamikaze pilots. Now, if they were getting shot down prior to this, they would aim for our boats, but they wouldn't make kamikaze runs. But this is the first time they did this. Now, you guys might be like, early in the war in the Pacific, MacArthur and the U.S. troops were thwarted in the Philippines. That goes back to the issues that we had at the Bataan Death March, where it was a 60-mile march of our troops. They had to go 60 miles, and all along the way they were being tortured. There were situations where the Japanese would lay our guys naked and they would let them freeze to death on the side of the road. There was times that they would castrate our men and leave them there, and they would cut them open and let them bleed out all along the route to remind the Americans that they were in control. And so I think one of the movies that I think actually does a pretty good job of showing you what the American situation of a POW, what it was like, is the movie Unbroken. You guys have probably heard of that movie before. It's a pretty cool movie, so if you get a chance, you should watch that. It kind of shows you a little bit about what life as an American POW by the Japanese was like. Other major battles would be Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Iwo Jima is where the Marines are lifting that flag at the very top of that volcanic island. Very iconic picture. There's a book attached to that, Flags of Our Fathers, by, I believe it's Bradley. Last name is Bradley. I think it's James Bradley, maybe. It's a pretty good book. And Okinawa is the worst fighting in the Pacific. The U.S. was finally close enough to start making bombing runs to Japan. So, as far as the atomic bombs go, after Okinawa, there was a large infantry ready to invade Japan. However, due to Japanese mindset of fighting to the very last man, heavy casualties would be as a result. And you might be like, what do you mean fighting the last man? There would be times that they would be outnumbered 100 to 2 or 3, and they would still run at our guys with bayonets attached, trying to kill people. So you always had to be on guard, and so they just didn't want to surrender. That wasn't their mindset, which is a little bit different than what the Germans were like. When they felt like they were outnumbered, they just gave up and knew that the Americans wouldn't torture them. The Japanese were different. In 1942, the Manhattan Project had begun. This was directed by J. Robert Oppenheimer, and the project employed over 100,000 people and cost over $2 billion to create. The power behind the bomb came from splitting the atom. And the Manhattan Project, if you're wondering what it is the creation of the atomic bomb. Why did they call it the Manhattan Project? Well, that way, if somebody found out what it was, they would not know that the Manhattan Project just sounded like it's something coming from New York. It was successfully tested in July of 1945. President Truman implored the Japanese to surrender or face utter destruction. Now, a lot of people are wondering, how much did Truman know? Truman kind of heard that this was going on, but FDR kind of kept him in the dark. Perhaps there was a level of mistrust there, not really sure. But President Truman, once he found out that he had this, felt like it was worth trying to consider using. After consulting with his allied leaders, that would be, like his own Joint Chiefs of Staff, but also even Churchill, after consulting with his allied leaders and advisors, he decided to drop the bomb. And we had 3 bombs, one that we tested and 2 that we used. We didn't tell them that, obviously, but we dropped one on Hiroshima on 8/6/45, and then told them they needed to surrender. And if they didn't, we'd drop another one. So on 8/9/45, we decided to drop one on Nagasaki. Around 250,000 died either immediately or as a result of the radiation between the 2 bombing attacks. Japanese numbers are considerably higher on that. Could be propaganda, could be truth, could be people that still died from lasting effects of this later on. Now, why didn't they surrender after the first one? There's a lot of places where you'll read that the Japanese were trying to figure out how to organize themselves to actually surrender, and that they were working on it, and that the Americans didn't listen to them. That said, we felt like they could have just contacted us and said, "We're out, we're done, please don't kill us anymore." On September 2nd, 1945, MacArthur receives a formal surrender on the USS Missouri, and that is what we would consider Victory in Japan Day, or VJ Day. So VE Day is May 8th, 1945. VJ Day is September 2nd, 1945. And within 3 years, basically, of America getting involved in World War II, we were able to defeat these 2 massive superpowers, and I guess technically 3 if you want to include the Italians. We are on top of the world. This is where you have huge parades, massive parades, and American nationalism is at its peak. Americans are coming home. They are so excited. They are so fired up that we were able to do what we were able to do over in Europe. And it was really cool. And we are on an emotional high, feeling like we can conquer everything. This is where you get that classic picture of like the sailor kissing the girl in, in New York and Times Square, that type of stuff. And now, as a matter of time, we eventually get all of our troops home in order to get back to some normalcy. So what we're going to do is we're going to finish up talking about some wartime conferences tomorrow, and talking about a lot of these meetings that had lasting effects on our American policy.